Hey everyone, it's Anthony from Pretty Print It here. In today's video, I'll talk about how to use tiles in Bulma. So tiles are just these things that we have here. So it's basically you're laying out a grid of elements using Bulma. So here you have 5 different elements and they are all in different spots and they have different sizes. And if you scroll down here on the tiles page, you see other options. So here's one with 3 tiles. And then here's another one, which is just the same one that we saw before, except it doesn't have any color. And then here's one with quite a bit more columns and rows. And this one is actually a standalone one. It's close to the tile above it, but this is kind of separate. So this one has 2 columns, and then this one has multiple rows and columns. So in this video, I'll be showing you the process that you need to go through to create one of those. So tiles, they can be a little tricky, especially the parent and child part, but hopefully after watching this video, you'll understand it a little more. But just know that it takes a bit of practice. So even if you don't understand it the first time watching the video, just try creating your own and eventually it will come to you. Like, it will make sense. It should all click, but it may take a few tries to get that to actually click for you. So the first thing you need to know when creating these layouts using tiles is you first start from left to right. So you basically think about the columns that you're interested in having. So in this particular case, I see 3 columns, but it's actually only 2 columns to begin with. So this wide tile down here takes up all the space for one of the columns, and then this tall tile on the right takes up the space for the other column. And what's going on with these 3 tiles here is they're kind of like a sub-tile of the first column. So it's basically you have 2 columns, and then you divide the first column up into 2 columns, and then you add more tiles in there. So 2 columns to begin with, and then 1 column is divided into 2 columns. So when you think of columns, you have to think about what goes across at the widest point, and then everything else would be a subtile. So when I create this or recreate this example, it will all make sense. And then after that, you have to think about things from top to bottom. So after you think about from left to right, you have to think about from top to bottom. So are there any tiles stacked on top of each other? So in this particular case, I see vertical here, I see tiles here, and I see wide tile. So those are stacked. So vertical is on the top, tiles in the middle, and wide is on the bottom. So there's a way to approach that. So that's what I'm going to cover in this video. The modifiers are really important for tiles. So there are 3 contextual modifiers. There's is ancestor, which we'll always be using, is parent, and is child. So of course we'll be using all 3, but is ancestor is the first one. So I'll show you that in a moment. And then is parent and child depend on where you put the content in your tiles. Then we have the directional modifier, which is for telling Bulma that some tiles are going to be stacked on top of each other. So by default, things go from left to right, but if you use is vertical, then you can start thinking of things from top to bottom. So that's what is vertical is for. And then you have the horizontal size modifiers. So is 1 through is 12. So basically it's based off the 12 column grid layout, and this particular one, for example, goes across 8 columns, and then this tall tile is across 4. So if you want some columns to be wider than others, then you'll have to use the is and then the number after it. So here is just some instructions on how to approach that, and that's basically what I'll be talking about. So I'm going to recreate this one first. There's 1, 2, 3. And let me go to my code and show you what I have. So basically I have a hero and a footer. So if I go here, you see a hero, a footer, and then there's a section with a container that has nothing in it. So if you're not familiar with sections and containers, just go to my previous video where I talk about them. But this is where I'm going to put the tiles that I create in this video. So to create this one, like I said, the first thing you want to do is you want to add the ancestor tile. So let me go to my code, and right here what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tile. So the class is going to be tile, of course, very straightforward. So tile, but I'm also going to add an is ancestor class. So this tile is going to wrap all the other tiles in my grid of tiles. So now that I have that, I can start thinking about the layout of the tiles. So in this particular case, we see that I have 2 columns because remember I want to start by going from left to right. So I have 2 columns. I have 1 column here, and then I have the second column over here that just has all the 3 in it. So to handle that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 divs that are class tile within that, and that will handle both columns. So tile 1 and then tile 2. So I have these 2 tiles. So this is going to be the left column and this is going to be the right column. And now that I have those, I can start thinking about the size. So we see that column 1, or the first column, is 4 wide and the second is 8 wide. So we can put the size on the first. So we can say is 4, and that means that this will take up 4 columns of space in a sense, and then the other column will take up 8. And now that I have the size, what I want to think about is the vertical part. So I have the 2 columns. The second column doesn't have anything stacked on top of each other, so I don't have to worry about that, but the first one does. We see 1 is on top of 2, so I have to tell Bulma that the first column should be treated as it will have more than 1 tile in it that will be on top of some other tile. So to do that, you're going to add the is vertical modifier. So is vertical. And that's basically telling Bulma that what follows will be laid out vertically. So inside of this div now, every single tile div that I add will go from top to bottom. So if I add 1 tile, that's the top. And if I add another tile, that's the one on the bottom. So now that I have the tiles laid out in the way that I want, now I have to start thinking about the parent-child relationships. And it's easiest to start with the child and work your way back up to the parent. So basically a child is any tile that has actual content in it. So whatever you want to display, that is going to be a child. So in this particular case, 3 and then this text here is the content for the tile. So that needs to be is child. So let's start with the first one right here. So the first one right here, we're going to call this a child because I'm going to put some content in it, and that content will be 1. So let me change this to title, or it's going to be a paragraph title, and I'll just say 1. So I'm going to follow along with the headers that they have here, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to create another one called 2. And this tile needs to be is child because what's inside of it is actual content. And then once you have the children, you can start thinking about the parents. The parent has to be the direct ancestor of the element. So we see I have div class is child. So the tile directly above it, in terms of the relationship, not in terms of where it goes in the code, but we see that this div is a child of this div. So this div will become the parent, is parent. And just know that if it's an ancestor already, it can't become a parent. So you'll have to create a separate parent. But if I get to an example like that, I'll show you what I mean. But this is parent because it has 2 children as direct descendants. In this particular case, I'm going to have three. And then if I put is child here, I'm actually going to get to that example that I just mentioned. So is child here, that means that the direct ancestor of this needs to be the parent. So if I go up 1, it says ancestor. Well, I just said that ancestor can't be a parent as well. So what I have to do is I have to create its own parent, and then inside of that, I'll create the child. So I'll create another tile, is child, and then I'll put that paragraph that I just created inside of it. Okay. So now I should have everything working correctly. So if I go to my page and refresh, I see 1, 2, 3. And just to make it more clear, I'll make this a box. So each child is going to be a box so you can see the outline of it. and refresh. And now we see it looks pretty much just like what we have here. There's no text, obviously, but the general layout is exactly the same. And that's exactly what I want. So as long as you think from left to right first, and then you think from top to bottom, you'll be able to build these, even though it can get a little tricky as things get more complicated, but you'll see that the process is the same. So now what I'll do is I'll replicate this one. So what I'll do is I'll create another section. And I'll also create a container. I can't spell container. There we go. And I'll create that is ancestor tile to start with. So is ancestor. And that's going to be the very beginning of my second set of tiles. So now let's take a look at this one because we want to replicate it. So going from left to right, how many columns do I have? Well, it's easy to say 3, but if you look closely, you see that this Y tile takes up a lot of space. So you have to think about the tile that takes up the most space, and that is going to be the size of your overall column. So there are actually only 2 columns here to begin with, and then the first column is further divided up into 2 more columns. So to handle that in the code, I'm going to create 2 columns. So tile, that's the first column. Tile, that's the second column. So let me just add comments. This first column, and then this is going to be the second column. Okay, so now I have the 2 columns. Now I have to think about the size. So this first column is going to be wider than the second column. This is going to take up 8 spaces. So first column is 8. Okay. So now that I have that, I can start thinking about how the first column is organized. So there are a couple of things going on here. First, I have one that has 2 smaller columns in it. So I have 4 spaces here, 4 spaces here, which is inside of this big tile of 8 spaces. And I also have elements stacked on top of each other. So to think about this, you can think about it in a sense that there are subtiles. So you can take this area here, so the vertical tiles and middle tile, and think of it as being one tile just to begin with. And then we'll divide it up into smaller pieces later, kind of repeating the same process. So I have this one big tile that I'm imagining it's stacked on top of this Y tile. So because of that, I'm going to be thinking about is vertical. So inside of my is 8, it will have some vertical parts. So is vertical. And it's going to have a tile there. So this is going to be our imagined subtile. Like you don't actually get to see this in a sense, but you have to imagine it when you're creating the grid. And then this one's going to be the bottom tile in the first column. Okay, so now this is the bottom tile. So here it's called Y tile. And then in our imagined subtile, I can further divide it up into pieces. So this one big subtile has 2 columns in it. So I'll add 2 tiles. So column 1, column 2. And then column 1 allows for an element to be under another one. So I have to use is vertical, whereas the second column inside of this subtile doesn't have that. So this will be is vertical, and it's going to have 2. So 1, 2. Okay. So now that I have all that there, I can start adding in the content because this should be exactly what I want. Now, it's going to get a little tricky because of the parent-child relationships, but once you have the parent-child relationships right, then it will look exactly like you want it to look. So let's start here since I was just dealing with this. We know that because this is vertical and it's the first column in our subtile, this corresponds to the vertical here, and then the other one corresponds to tiles. So let's just put some titles in there. So P title, and this is going to be vertical, and then this one is going to be tiles, just to match what we have here. And then the tile that's in the other column represents the middle tile. So I'll just put middle tile there. And then the Y tile is the next one that I'm interested in. So I have the comments, so I already know what it's supposed to be. So Y tile. And then finally, I have the tall tile. Not title, but tile. Oh yeah, it's actually title. They're so close to each other, it's easy to get tile and title mixed up. I mean, title only has one additional character, but tall tile there. All right, so I have the 5 pieces of content that will go into my layout, but now I have to think about the parent and child relationships. So remember what I said about the child always being the tile that has the content. So if I start with this one, I can say this is going to be is child because it has the paragraph vertical. And then I can say is child because it has tiles. And I can do the same thing with all of them. So you can populate the child ones first. Is child. Okay, so now that I have all the children, I need to start adding the parents. So these 2 children are siblings and they have one parent. So I can add a direct, or I look at the direct ancestor, which is this tile is vertical, and I can make that is parent because there will be no collisions when I do that. And when you do this, you may have to go back and edit some, but we'll see how it works out with this particular layout. So is vertical is parent because it has 2 children here. Let's move on to this one. So we have is child here. So we look at the direct ancestor of this. And if you have a text editor or you just indent your HTML in a certain way, a text editor that indents the HTML for you, this will be a lot easier to see. If you don't have that, then it may be a little more difficult. So just keep that in mind. But I have is child here. So the direct ancestor, just the parent element of this, is this class tile. But if I add it is parent here, the problem is I don't have a child that is a direct descendant of this other than the one here, because right here I have is parent. You can't have a parent be a child of a parent. A parent has to be a parent of a child. I know it sounds kind of weird to say it, but just looking at it, you can't have parent. It always has to go parent child. So you know you can't put the parent there. So that means down here, you have to create its own parent. So I'll create a tile is parent, and then I'll just put everything inside of there. Okay. So that takes care of the ones over there. So now let's take a look at this child. We're actually, let's see. Yeah, I skipped one. So this is the Y child, and like I said, this could actually, no, it's not going to be a child. So looking at this one, is child. We see is parent here, so I'm going to have to add its own parent. So tile, and then is parent. And I'll just move this inside and format this. Okay. So let me just make sure all my children have parents in this section. So these 2 children have a parent. This child has a parent. And then this child has a parent. And now our last tile in the second column needs a parent. So starting from here, going up 1, looking is ancestor. Is ancestor can't be a parent. So I need to make is parent, or I shouldn't put it that way. I should just say create a tile that is parent outside of it, and then I'll move everything inside. Okay, so that should be it. Let's take a look and see what happens. So we see it looks like everything is in the right spot. Let me put a box around it just so we can see the outline. So for every child, I'm going to put a box. And a box there. Okay. Refresh. And we see that this looks just like the one I have here. Obviously, it's not as colorful and there's no text for one of the tiles. But other than that, the layout itself is exactly what I want it to look like. So you see, we can get this to work as long as we follow a consistent process. Now, I know it can be a little tricky, so if you don't quite get it, I recommend watching this video again and trying it on your own, because trying it on your own is ultimately how you're going to understand it. But the process of first thinking from left to right, and then thinking from top to bottom, and then subdividing things if you need to, is the approach that I would take when you're laying out the tiles. And of course, creating the parent-child relationships, you just start with the children and then you work your way back up to the parents. And then once you're done with that, everything should look good. So the process would be the same for any of these other ones. So I recommend that you try to create something a little more difficult. So this is actually the exact same one I just created. But for example, this one is something you can try. Just know that the side column and main column, these are separate from the ones above it, because once you have a situation like this where you have some overlap in the columns, you can no longer use the tile layout in one group that is covered under the ancestors. So you'll find if you look at the code, there will be one ancestor for this group here and then the second ancestor there. You can put them right next to each other, but they don't actually go inside of the same ancestor. Just keep that in mind. And then laying out the ones here is exactly the same. So for example, you start with how many columns? Let's see. We have, this one looks like it also has multiple ancestors. So just looking at it, let's see, there's one ancestor, two ancestors, three ancestors. Yeah, so they just divided the page up into different pieces to get it to work correctly. So I believe they are doing this 1, 2, 3, 4 is one, this 5 through 11 as another one, and this 12 through 14. But just know that, for example, with 5 through 11, you would divide up into 4 columns. And then you would start thinking about having sub-tiles in a sense. And then one sub-tile will be divided up into 1, 2 columns. And then you have yet another sub-tile that is divided up into 2 columns. And then the other one has 2 columns as well, from 9 to 10. So it can be a little tricky, but the process is exactly the same. And whatever layout you envision, it will pretty much be the same process. So if you have any questions about that, just let me know in the comments and I can definitely help you out. So that's pretty much it for this video. I just want to remind everyone, if you haven't been to my website already, prettyprinted.com, you can check it out. I have a ton of videos on there. I have courses for various things, and I'm always adding more videos to this. And I have premium courses that are like, over 10 hours long of content, so you can check those out as well. Prettyprinted.com is the site. So if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed to my channel already, please subscribe. So thank you for watching this video, and I will talk to you next time.